this course, I've attempted to give introductions to various issues, themes, and goals that represent the trajectory of theology, especially in the last 100 years. At each point, I am cutting out significantly more material than I am putting in. I am reducing whole libraries of discussions to a short representation of key figures and ideas. And in this, I have attempted to not only give a perspective on modern theology as it leads into contemporary theology, but also to help provide an orientation for who we are today. Why are we looking at the questions we are asking now? Why are we dealing with the problems we are dealing with today? But also pointing toward where theology is moving. And if you've read the texts and engaged the lectures, you hopefully are already picking up on this trajectory. All throughout, in these first weeks, trying to cover the massive amount of ground that could itself be a whole degree program, I've wanted to show where theology has been in the last 200 years, plus years, where we are now, and also point to where we are going in the future. And in each of these, I have left out material that is so essential and so helpful. But my goal is not to cover everything. My goal is not to be comprehensive. My goal is to provide markers on this exploration of theology in its bigger sense. Markers so that you, as you press on in your own studies and in your own ministries and in whatever you are doing, you will have a sense of how this trajectory has oriented, shaped, and continues to guide us. So in giving you a sense of this trajectory, I'm hoping to offer points of beginning, points of interest, aspects that you can say, oh, I'd like to learn more about that, and then give you just enough of a foothold to do that. That was the problem with this. In trying to do too much, you can go in different directions. You can dig deep in a narrow set of topics, or you could be so wide as to hopefully not be shallow, but be so wide as to give a scope. And my goal is to give a scope. Why do I start with that preface here? Because of the many topics we are covering in these first weeks in covering modern theology and contemporary theology, none hits me more that I am leaving out far, far, far too much. And in doing that, doing essentially a disservice to the discussion and potentially say, what's the point of doing it at all? Really, there is a point. By giving you these markers, by even saying so little that some of you might say, well, how about this? How about this question? How about this issue that he didn't discuss about? I'm not trying to say I am covering everything. In fact, I'm inviting those discussions, those points at which you say, why doesn't he talk about this? Why doesn't he talk about that? What about this section? What about that? Those are the very questions I'm inviting you into so that you can study them, you can share with them, you can gather together with friends or other interested folks. You can get people interested and continue to dig deep in these discussions. You can write a research paper about any of these elements. In this overly reductionistic attempt to encapsulate a very wide, diverse, immensely important discussion, I'm going to be talking about some basics of can be variously called global theology. In the past has been called contextual theology. I think I've changed the title of this particular lecture 4 or 5 times. At this point, I'm going with theology with a wider lens, because what I want to do in this is point to how the questions of the past, the issues of the present, are pointing toward new contexts that are themselves wrestling with their questions and concerns that come out of their context, and also will be continuing to shape the face, the voice, the content of Christianity. When we talk about global theology, we're not talking about some extra added part, which we may have been 100 or 200 years ago, where Christianity existed throughout the world, but was not as popular or numerous. Well, that's changed. Even discussions of 50 years ago and how they frame this discussion are outdated. Right now, we're looking at the reality that it's not much longer before the global discussion of Christianity is not only a major player in theological discussions, but is a primary driver and primary source of Christian theology. Christian theology in 100 years will be primarily African and Asian. reflecting the kinds of issues and concerns rising from those contexts in conversation with church tradition, which will include European and North American discussions. And don't let we leave out, of course, South American and other contexts of North America that haven't been included in the more establishment theologies. When I talk about theology with a wider lens, I'm highlighting the fact that theology, in its many varied sense, is an attempt to understand who God is and how God is working in light of our questions, in light of our forms of communication. And all these together, from their various eras of tradition, from their various places, from their various social locations, feed into a developing, expanding, empowering kind of theology. One of the barriers of talking about global theology for a while is that for a long time theology was thought to be entirely objective. One person could write a theology that applied equally everywhere. In the modern era, this became more intentional, that modern theologians and others thought that there is this sense that rationality itself is wholly objective, and so they, even though they were self-aware that there were different cultures and differences in these cultures and that humanity was very different, they assumed and asserted that theology was not in keeping with that, and that theology was something that was true in all ways, in all the same ways for people. Now, there were distinctions with this, but that was the prevailing thought really up through the mid-20th century. Theologians were confronted with the fact that there were different questions based on different experiences of life. Space was made. The idea that there were Christians now arising from these other global contexts with fully developed theological training, often from established institutions, but then in going back to their context, they were beginning to ask new questions. And those who were in the earlier context of Europe were realizing these were very highly educated and highly esteemed colleagues who were changing how theology was being discussed, and they couldn't but start respecting that. And yet, respect and listening and incorporating are two different things. They could honor that there was voices coming from different places, but there was still a resistance to whether or not that would have any broader impact or it could contribute to the bigger chorus of Christian theology. That's why it was called contextual theology. It was theology from those other places, not the real theology. And so these theologians who had these different questions based on their settings and their own culture and all the rest had to begin to demand. They had to push themselves out into places where their voices could be heard so that their experiences could be incorporated and discussed broadly as part of the broader Christian dialogue. Such questions and approaches to theology was given the name contextual theology, and really up until the last 5-10 years, that was the phrase we used. And yet that has really fallen out of fashion, especially at Fuller, where we are intentionally trying to say there is nowhere without a context. All theology is contextual. And because of this, we don't want to label some as contextual theology and others as establishment theology, as if established or traditional or conventional models of theology were devoid of their context. As much as the theologians who developed that theology thought it was devoid of context, it is rife with contextual issues and questions, as we've already discussed throughout. So this is the problem that we faced really coming into the contemporary era, and we're still wrestling with. There was a sense of standard theology, and then there's contextual theology. Indeed, across many theological schools, seminaries, graduate schools, this is still pretty much the case. There is an assumption that there is standard theology that has been discussed for 100, 200 years using many of the same major figures and wrestling with them. And then there's this other theology in which we'll throw in a text or two. But then this raises the question, right? Where was conventional theology being developed? Was it being developed in a vacuum? Was it being developed outside of the experience of time? No. Well, what made it the standard? Theologies that were developed in other settings were called contextual, but why were they contextual and then there was a standard theology? How can we argue that there is this lesser work of the Spirit, this auxiliary work of the Spirit in other places, but you have the main work of the Spirit in certain places? This is the trouble, because now, even though a fair amount of historical Christian theology developed in the regions that were called contextual, they didn't entirely linger with the Christian message, and so were predominantly outsiders to Christian theology, and so it made sense to consider some other regions more contextual, more supportive kind of theology, that rather than the core where it was being the center of the Christian theological world. So it would have made sense in the early 20th century, but that's not the same anymore. And then it really hasn't been the same for the last 50 years. As this very class, as the people watching this video represent, an increasingly amount of global discussions that are not new to Christianity, but growing in multi-generational reflection and engagement. Christianity is booming in the context. These places that were formerly called contextual, areas of theology are going to be the new centers of Christianity in coming decades. So, to call other global theologies contextual and assume that there is this standard is now outdated, outmoded, and unhelpful. And yet, as I have stated throughout, one of the goals of this course is to see the trajectory of Christian theology so that we know where we've been, we know where we are, and we know where we're going as a church and as Christian theology. And it still remains the fact that the bulk, the massive, the overwhelming amount of material to read that has been developed over the centuries comes from a European, and then especially in the last 100 years from a North American context. So while we resist the term contextual theology, we're still dealing with the fact that there is a majority of Christian reflection coming from European perspectives. And so the weight of the Christian discussion, the weight of the theological libraries is still lingering with older models. And so this is where we are encouraging each other to take these older models and apply them to our context so that coming generations won't have to rely on outmoded theology or decontextualized theology as if that were possible, or theology from contexts that are no longer true even in the same setting. Increasingly, again, we know that all theology from the very beginning is contextual, derived from particular experiences, settings, philosophical milieus that it's not that God changes, but how we talk about God, God makes sense, how we share the gospel to others, how we talk about the questions being asked are shaped by our context and philosophies and issues and concerns. Paul, the apostle, he was from West Asia, so he wrote in a certain way that reflected his Jewish experiences in the Roman Empire. Augustine was North African, Aquinas was Southern European, Martin Luther was Northern European, John Wesley, English. They were all writing from not only their context in space, but also in time. And the later ones relied on the early ones, but they adapted and shaped it. And so too, that's the invitation more broadly, so that theologians, some of you who will dig further and deeper, ideally all of you, right, in your own way, are taking those who have gone before, but not limiting yourselves as if you were in their context and writing to the people of their time. So their experiences as men shape their understanding as well. And this is the other challenge of theology. It's all being written from a certain gender experience, and so that shapes how conversations of power, how interpretations take shape, and then that gets passed down, and then who gets the most authority, theology tends to reinforce, like at any field, you tend to reinforce your own social location so that your voice is empowered. Well, then where are the women who are left out of that? Susanna Wesley, for instance, is a great example of how the theology of her time was very limiting. She was extremely well read. If you read her letters and her journal, she was interacting with philosophers and scholars and church history. I would indeed argue that even though her husband was a ordained and long-standing minister himself, I honestly think Susanna Wesley was smarter and more read than he was. And yet, because of the role, he had the opportunity to be ordained and to be a minister, and she was a mother and ended up having 19 children. So she spent most of her life pregnant and or recovering from pregnancy and or raising kids. I think only 10 of whom lived to adulthood. So there was just a lot of trauma and pain, and her body was just wrecked by this. And so I'm repeating things in her journal so that all this ability to reflect theologically was shaped by her calling as a woman in the mid 18th century, when you were supposed to have a lot of kids because a lot of them didn't survive. But in her letters, in her writing, there's this brilliance here that in our era may have most likely given her a pathway to her own voice and contributions. So which experience of life is to be the standard? We talked about which time and place is supposed to be the standard, but what is the experience of life? Is there only one kind of person that the Spirit interacts with that then all the other people must go to? Is there only one class? Is there only one culture that Jesus attended to? Well, yes, Jesus did attend to Jewish culture. He talked to different people in different classes and men and women, but he talked to Jewish. And so most of us are already outside the immediate culture that Jesus himself focused on. And so we're all outsiders. If there's one claim to be the standard theology, it really would be Jewish perspectives on theology. So it's not just wrong-headed, it's a little arrogant to shove ourselves, those of us who come from a non-Jewish perspective, into the front and say this is now the standard. Well, we barely got in. If you read Acts 15, us Gentiles, we had to have whole church debates and conferences and arguments and letters passed back and forth about whether Gentiles could come in as we are. That certainly doesn't give us permission then to say, okay, now that we're in, we're going to tell everyone else what they have to think. Which region is the standard to which all other regions must relate? Which era is the standard to which all other eras must relate? Which gender is the standard? All these questions are reflected in the theologies we tend to use. And that's not to negate those theologies. It's just to say those theologies are not themselves absolute or comprehensive. And almost every denomination, almost every church picks a different region or a different era or a different gender to focus on. Most of the latter is focused on men, of course. But everyone finds that this is the place where they think the Spirit is working the most. And for those of you who have already taken a class on pneumatology, you know that the Spirit isn't limited to any region, era, or gender. There's no limitation. That's the beauty of Acts 2, right? Peter goes out into the street and everyone heard the preaching in their own language, and then they took this message and went out. The whole brilliance of the ascension is that Jesus goes to heaven and the Spirit is sent to the people. So now, wherever the people go, all over the world becomes these places of resonance of the Messianic mission. Our approaches to theology then offered implicit answers to these questions. They still do. Inasmuch as they create a standard, however, they're deficient. If we say my social location or social experience is the standard by which every other standard must be measured, I'm putting myself in the place of God. And I'm saying my social location, era, gender, go down the list, is somehow this is where God chooses to work and everyone else comes secondary. Well, that's an arrogance even Jesus didn't want to hold on to, because what did Jesus do? He said, I'm going back to the Father, I'm sending the Spirit, and the Spirit's going to go all over the earth. God is the standard. And God's work extends through the whole world, throughout history, through men, through women, even through children, in every setting. And one of the beautiful things about the era we're in is we're seeing this blossoming of the Spirit's work in a way that has hardly been seen throughout the last 2,000 years, and maybe has never been seen. We had whispers of this in the first few centuries around the Mediterranean, but now, even in this class, we're having people from all over the world sharing together this common voice and yet bringing to the table their own experiences, concerns, and histories. And the more we hear about this, the more we begin to see the wondrous broadness of God's work. Let me read a key passage of what I'm getting at. 1 Corinthians 12 through 26 says this: just as a body, though one, has many parts, but all its many parts form one body, so it is with Christ. For we were all baptized by one Spirit so as to form one body, whether Jews or Gentiles, slave or free. And we were all given the one Spirit to drink. Even so, the body is not made up of one part, but of many. Now if the foot should say, because I am not a hand, I do not belong to the body, it would not for that reason stop being part of the body. And if the ear should say, because I am not an eye, I do not belong to the body, it would not for that reason stop being part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would the sense of hearing be? If the whole body were an ear, where would the sense of smell be? But in fact, God has placed the parts in the body, every one of them, just as he wanted them to be. If they were all one part, where would the body be? As it is, there are many parts, but one body. The eye cannot say to the hand, I don't need you. And the head cannot say to the feet, I don't need you. On the contrary, those parts that seem to be weaker are indispensable, and the parts that we think are less honorable we treat with special honor. And the parts that are unpresentable are treated with special modesty, while presentable parts need no special treatment. But God has put the body together, giving greater honor to the parts that lacked it, so that there should be no division in the body, but that its parts should have equal concern for each other. If one part suffers, every part suffers with it. If one part is honored, every part rejoices with it. Now, Paul doesn't necessarily limit this to what someone does as contributing on a Sunday morning. This is often how we apply it, the spiritual gifts, which is right because this is a passage that relates to that. But think of this in every aspect of the Christian life. Think in terms of our social life. Think in terms of our economic life. Think in terms of our theology. What if theology started with this idea that we all come at this discussion about God from a certain perspective and a certain role, but that no one part has the whole? And even within cultures, the discussion of God has so often been narrowed not just to a specific region or a specific language or a specific skin color, but has been narrowed to a specific, very, very narrow kind of person within that culture who works in academia. And then this exceedingly narrow range of participants then somehow project of what Christian theology is to the rest of their culture, to the rest of the world. Is that what God intended? So does this passage have implications for theological studies? I claim that it does, but what do you think? And then, so this is where I'm inviting you to wrestle, not just with the discussion here, but wrestle with Scripture. How does Scripture treat discussions that are coming from outside the context of the main establishment? And if it does have implications for theological studies, how do we, in our own context, in our own ministries, in our own calling, take this seriously? To say, yes, I have a role, but my role isn't to then dictate or demand or speak for everyone. What if my role is to contribute, but also to listen? And this is how I want to teach. This kind of passage isn't just something I'm rhetorically saying. I genuinely am trying to encourage those who are listening to this and those who are participating to participate more, to share, to dig into your context as much as possible, to wrestle with what God is doing, what God is saying in conversation with the resources that I'm talking about, the readings and all the rest. How do we take it seriously? We enter into the context, not just saying, I'm going to deliver the Spirit to these people, but I'm also going to listen for the Spirit's work that's already happening. And they may not be as educated, may not be as committed, but that doesn't mean there is a lack of God's work. And so this embeds a inherent humility. How do we take it seriously? We have to be humble. We have to be willing to listen. We have to be willing to hear prophetic words and insights from the most surprising of directions. How do we take this serious in orthodoxy? That's a big question, because when it comes to right thinking, we think we have an established idea of who Jesus is. And maybe we do in part, but there are also questions in people who have wrestled deeply with the ways of God in ways that the most advanced scholar never had to deal with because of their relatively privileged life. Well, who do we listen to in understanding how God works in response to pain or suffering? I know a big part of my understanding of theodicy, which is the problem of evil, why does God cause pain, has been radically shaped by those who have gone through much worse circumstances or have severe chronic illnesses. And it shapes my understanding in response to that away from trying to consider a philosophical proof, and really points to the reality of grace that is in the lives of these people, that shifts the question away from what someone from the outside might be asking. How do we think of this in terms of orthopathy? Well, sometimes scholars who have all the right thinking oftentimes are not people you want to hang out. They're crabby. They're always wanting to have this very constrained experience. Sometimes my emotions aren't in tune with what God is wanting of a situation. Sometimes I need to listen to those who are more emotionally aware, emotionally in tune, more sympathetic, more empathetic, people who have spent a lot of their life really engaged in emotional wisdom so that they have an understanding of how to interact with each other and situations to have the right passions and desires. I need to learn from them. I focused a lot of my time on thinking, and though I've come to the emotional and desires, certainly it's been a secondary way of just how I navigate with my personality. So I need other people to help guide me in these discussions. What does that mean in orthopraxy? Similar to the last. I'm someone who likes to learn. I like to think. I like to teach. I like to engage in a lot of deep reading and writing. And because of my introversion, it's very easy for me to stay inside, to say, here, my calling is to stay inside, to write. Well, then that could cause me to be prickly about those who might interfere that, but people who have a true presence in my life I need to respond to, like my family. Or staying inside can actually restrict my understanding so much that I need to get out and help people. And in doing that, it actually causes a resonating kind of reflection that adds to, doesn't detract from my thinking. But I have to often have to be said, this is the right thing to do. Or in terms of morality, right? So many of the theologians and others we've talked about have this great theological package, but they have this difficult area of their life where it actually undermined and intruded in their theological conversations and contributions. I think here especially of Jean Vanier, who honestly I felt betrayed by when I heard of the kind of sexual harassment. And even then I don't know everything about his story, but I know enough to know that there was a brokenness in him, and that rather than listening to the fuller teaching that the Spirit was doing in him, he slipped, and that causes a major repercussion in his contribution. Karl Barth's the same way. People who knew him well said you shouldn't be interacting with your secretary in the way you are, and he just rejected that counsel. Now the discussion was raised in the discussions and in other places that I've read about how do we respond to someone whose morality of the time is different than ours. Should we judge them based on our understanding? No, I think we have openness there. I think we have openness to someone like King David who murdered. But even the scripture was a very sharp accusation against his adultery. The things that they knew were absolutely wrong and was wrong for him, we can and should judge them on. And so too the people who I've mentioned more recently. It wasn't like they were trying to live the best way they could and didn't know any better. They actually did know better. They were told better. Slavery is another issue. We can and should critique theologians of the 19th century who promoted and encouraged the continuation of slavery because they should have known better, because there was significant amount of worthwhile contribution rejecting this. We should go back earlier. There's nearly no point in Christian history where slavery could be justified, and so we can and should critique those who fell into that trap. So the actions then reflect a kind of theology, and we can and should assess people on their actions, and we can and should listen to other people who are responding to our actions. This is where Christian community comes in full, helping us to think rightly, to desire and to feel rightly, to act rightly, both in our moral, ethical choices, but also in our proactive helping of others. All theology is contextual, and that means what I just talked about in orthodoxy, orthopathy, and orthopraxy aren't just part of our limited discussion within a narrow range of one culture, but that we have to be attentive to the critiques and understanding more broadly, because oftentimes, they see in us things that our culture has made us blind to. And so we need a broad voice of people who are coming from a lot of different directions to help us in our weaknesses. And in our strengths, we can help them. It's a giving and sharing. It's not a one thing. Again, it's the body. All theology is contextual. That insight is really something that postmodern thought contributes. The idea that every place has a relative perspective. Now, we don't want to collapse into everything relative. There is no truth. There is. This is where Christ comes in this discussion. Christ is our center and orienting reality. So away with meta-narratives, away with the idea that there's this one narrow stamp that everyone has to be packaged and folded into, and if they don't fit, we just have to start cutting off parts of them in order to get them in a box. That's horrible. We want to see them as whole people. We want to hear them as whole people. We want to eat with them as whole people and they with us, so that together as whole people, not just these isolated cut up bits that have been fragmented into this amalgamation of some pseudo-humanity. No, Christ has made us whole. The Spirit is giving us a fullness of life. Some still linger. Some meta-narratives still linger. And so we have to put people in broader, still limiting categories in order to somehow make sense of the world. And that's just part of human nature. We do categorize. We do make labels, but we have to see how that's part of our way of navigating. That's not God's way of navigating. A lot of what can seem to be contemporary modes of analysis are actually redeploying modern era categorizations and meta-narratives. Think of how these huge titles are being used to attach to various frameworks, or this is what this group is all like, and so then there's no sense of complexity or stories or reality. And so in lumping whole groups into this category, you actually are losing a sense of what the Spirit is doing. This is something the world does, because the world doesn't have Christ as an orienting narrative. The world doesn't have the Spirit in the same way that those who follow Christ do, so that they don't have an ability to understand the pattern of complexity and unity that comes out of a fluid, embracing kind of diversity. And it doesn't mean there are good underlying goals within that. It just means we have to be attentive to where those are and separate these genuinely good goals from the misplaced attempt to put a meta-narrative in order to simplify the method, and in simplifying it, not actually reaching the goal. My critique here isn't just because I have aesthetic problem with this category. It's because it doesn't actually work. It actually undermines the goal. It doesn't get us there. But like our critiques about modern theology, if we're not engaging complexity of reality, we may be defeating our actual goals of analysis and effective action. That's my critique. It's not that I'm offended or bothered. It's that I actually want analyses and diagnoses that get us to the heart of the matter and provide effective responses, so that in participating with the work of the Spirit, we can actually experience and resonate transformation within our context that spreads through and to this whole world. So what are some of these lingering meta-narratives that continue to be held on and point to how even theological studies tends to categorize and put people in convenient boxes for easier analysis? Well, one approach is that when we read women, we assume they're doing feminist theology, and when the only time often a woman is used in theological studies is to talk about feminist theology. Women aren't as included in the official standard theology. There's a pseudo inclusion, but they're always made to talk about the things that are more specifically perspective of women. And or to go down another one is, as a Korean theologian, isn't talking about a standard global theology, but is developing Asian theology, restricting the Korean to this contextual theology that may have then intersection with more official kinds of theology. Or a Pentecostal is always and only Pentecostal. So if you want to know what someone is thinking about on one of the largest church movements in the world, you go to a Pentecostal theologian. But if you want to know what Christology is, you go to more established theologians. A white man is like all the other white men. Again, even versions of privilege and contextual majority, especially in North America and theological studies, can lead us back into another form of meta-narrative where we categorize everyone as having that same kind of privilege. We want to dismiss the oppressor, and then we take this meta-narrative and attach it to everyone who fits the model of those who have offended or those who have societal power, even if not everyone who is in that category fits into that thing. College students are only interested in, I once had a pastor who made this joke, if you want to get college students interested, you talk about one of two things. You talk about sex or you talk about the end times. If you really want to get them involved, you talk about sex in the end times. I was interested in a lot of other things when I was in college, and so too there's a complexity. We don't want to reduce a certain age to the broad set of interests that may be shared, but then we miss out maybe on people who are digging deep and in doing that alienating and no longer providing them a path to Christ. Or to put it more simplistically, speak with an accent, and that accent's your niche. That's the place that you occupy, and that's the voice that you have, and there's no going outside of that. Have a shade of skin tone? Well, there's your experience of life. Everyone with the same shade of skin tone has the exact same experience in life, right? Well, no. And especially now that we're talking about global theology, that's especially not true, because we have contexts where shared skin color isn't the factor of oppression, but there's other elements. So we have all these other complexities that can so easily be reduced to certain categories that we might want to focus on. And in reducing that, we actually lose the insight that the Spirit is giving through the unique particularity of any given person. Some physical parts insist on theological questions. Other physical parts insist on other theological questions. So we have this way of, again, saying this part will ask that part will ask that. We don't want to talk about academic theology, in any other setting, but how do we always know? We can't. Some of the best people, the respondents, I sometimes will post theological things on Facebook. Some of the best insights, and this was true even before then, have come from people who don't have formal education, who don't have this esteemed job that would give them credence, but they often have and I'm thinking of at least 2 or 3 people here, they have a wisdom that actually outstrips most of the academics I know. They have an integrated wisdom that actually can engage the work of God, but also translate that into what that means in terms of our moral life and our ethical life. And I've learned so deeply from them. But they don't fit the categories, right? Read or hear from one person who shares the traits you're focused on. You've learned what you can from all those people who share their traits. You want to read about black theology? Read James Cone. That's so common. And yet that is the challenge, right? Because James Cone, who is a great theologian, was also in 1960s and 1970s. That was when he really thrived. And so he's speaking out of a certain kind of context and sociality. But people who don't know any better, who that's their only exposure, think that's the discussion. We have to get beyond that. We have to get beyond thinking that one Asian representative represents all of Asia, or one African represents all of Africa, or let alone one Black American represents all people of color. right? We tend to be so reductionistic, and then in that there's this meta-narratives that come back in, and we become destructive just as we think we're trying to be diverse. What do? Well, we distrust the meta-narrative. We really do, and this is the call. We have to be careful about, even when good-hearted and good-intentioned people bring back meta-narratives, we have to be careful not to fall into that trap. This is the human tendency, because this is how we navigate everything in the world. We like to have things neatly labeled and pinned so we can catalog them and refer to them when we need someone with that voice. So we always have the go-to person. We even do this to ourselves. We always try to say, well, this is the thing I'm good at. I'm only going to speak into this thing. And then we resist trying to actually speak outside of that. So meta-narratives, even about our own story, even about our own life, slip back in. We gotta watch out for meta-narratives. They're very, very tricky. And even as much as we're talking about a postmodern era, so much of academic discussion these days really has devolved back into forms of modern insistence on meta-narratives in order to capture a complex situation or complex problem in a very reductionistic way. And what do meta-narratives always tend to lead towards? Forms of power seeking and control. They're very sneaky. They masquerade themselves, even in those who with the best intentions, and oftentimes those with the best intentions are genuinely pursuing the good, but the meta-narratives always will serve those who use those meta-narratives to take control. It's only in undermining the meta-narratives and complexity that we allow the Spirit to work from below. How do we push against this tendency? Instead of beginning with generalizations, we listen and watch for particularities. This is difficult because it means we actually have to be attentive at every point in our life and always be open and listening. And we don't have time for it all. We don't have space for it all. And so there's going to be a certain amount of our reality in which we say, I don't know enough about that, but I know a little. And again, this is where humility comes into the discussion. I know a little about African theology. I would not say I know African theology in its whole scope because of the fact that I have read enough, but there's so many other voices that this is where then I say I need African people to come in and speak. And in fact, I'm part of a Facebook group called African Christian Theology. I rarely post there, but I listen and I learn for these discussions that are happening. The question of our differences need not be divisive. And this is where stories come in. And this is where our unity in Christ and our understanding of Christ's love and the work of the Spirit is important. Because so often we think if we have different starting places or different elements or even contrary elements, such as someone who was born really wealthy versus someone who was born very poor, those differences need not be divisive. But if we listen for particular stories, we can learn from each other. We can learn in the hopes and dreams and insights, but we can also learn from each other's brokenness. God is infinite, and God is eternal. So God doesn't fit into any of our categories. If we thought one version of a systematic theology could somehow encompass everything you need to know about God, your God's not big enough. And so often Christian theology, in trying to encompass God into a narrow range of knowable answers to established questions, has narrowed God into a package that doesn't resonate with anyone. God transcends that. God is infinite, and so is so far beyond even all the gathered people who have ever lived all over the world. Speaking together still would not sum up who God is. So unity through diversity really is a Trinitarian reality. It's an ecclesial goal. It's saying all of our different perspectives and experiences are part of this because God is interacting, and so God is calling and God is revealing in big meta-narrative ways. God can do this because he's God, but also in specific elements that often cause contrasting experiences. Now, if you think that's problematic, well, read the Bible. Read how Jesus responded to people. There's a nuance of complexity of God's response that doesn't fit into a general set of rules, which is why Jesus protested the Pharisees' legalism. Not because he had a problem with the law, but because they didn't understand actually the spirit within the law, the capital S Spirit, that is actually navigating through the complexity and the case studies. And the Bible is full of these stories so that we get a wideness of God's view, so that in this wider view we can begin to start getting really an aesthetic sense of what God is doing that can shape our instincts even before it gets into our rational side. It is by the gathered voices speaking together and listening together about theology that we can begin to understand the scope of God's complexity. Thus, theology has to be contextual. All theology is contextual because of God's complexity. A contextuality, we're all coming out of context, that brings us together. As we listen and learn, I want to listen and learn from you. I want to hear what God is doing, and that then shapes and informs me, and I speak and you listen. So discussing and sharing, we begin to have this bigger, stronger, expansive view of God that breaks outside of the boundaries that our social situations put on us. It's not bland agreeableness, but it's real conversation as our stories may overlap and provide differing, sometimes even opposing experiences. And in that, even in these paradoxes, we have to come to terms with how can we see God in this paradox? Because the reality is God works in a kind of complexity that at first seems paradoxical to us. And if you think that's out of bounds, look at how the world is shaped. Is light a particle or is it a wave? Yes. Those are two mutually different kinds of states, and yet there it is. So too God works at a level of complexity that sometimes may appear to us to be paradoxical, but it actually takes us thinking and wrestling and coming to terms with his complexity rather than limiting him to our level. Remember the previous oppressed and repressors discussions. Such experiences should not be overlooked, dismissed, but neither should they be totalizing. Someone isn't just, their being isn't being oppressed. They're, as an oppressed person, someone's being isn't as an oppressor. There's a complexity of everyone within those categories. They're expressing these things, but their core identity is something other than that. And it's this other thing that allows us to have these points of connection. Holistic liberation thus comes back into play. We realize that everyone has to find liberation from the places of slavery or shadows or hurt that they've been caught in, whether they have social privilege or not. And this is where love comes in too. We learn to love by learning to take seriously the particular reality of each person, just as God takes them seriously. Do we take people as seriously as God takes them? Or do we see them as targets or missions or purposes or tools or steps? But we don't see what God sees. And so we have to listen and learn, and sometimes that involves argument and disagreement. We're going to encounter people who bother us. Sometimes they bother us for reasons they might bother God, but oftentimes people who bother us are bothering us for this kind of brokenness in our lives. So how do we come to terms with that? We commit to each other as a community, no matter if there's disagreement or frustration. And we continue to commit to each other first, and in that we are allowed to have conversations that develop wisdom among us all. In the context of Christian commitment, such elements, argument and disagreement, don't have to be divisive, but they can be sanctifying. We can actually begin to grow in holiness in both thought and action because of the way people's frictions rub against us. Okay, for the interest in not just spending all our time in generalities or good goals, I'm going to give some short summaries of a couple theological contexts. First African and then Asian. And in this, I'm going to be admittedly falling knowingly into the trap that I just warned against about being relatively reductionistic, about taking whole continent and summarizing it in just a few slides as a representation of the wider conversation. But I think it's important because the alternative would be to leave out the specifics altogether and not touch on some key broad themes that are points of reflection among many different scholars that are coming at it with different concerns. And so in this, again, I'm not trying to say this is summing up the whole of these theologies, but really is a way of pointing towards some interpretive methods to understand where they're coming from and some big topics that are going to be driving questions of the future. And this is also meant to be included and encouraging towards reading voices from these contexts themselves, and some of you are from these contexts, and so your voice then can speak into these perspectives, limited this perspective. But this is a way of starting this point of conversation, just like I did with modern theology and postmodern theology. I gave some representative examples of people who made some marks, and not as a this is all you need to know, but as a way of saying here's a trajectory you can go if you're interested in studying more of this, and to also give us a sense of where the trajectory of the broader Christian theology is going. So the questions that they're asking in these contexts are really going to be the shaping issues of the Christian future, even if Europeans don't always know what to do with these questions. Note that liberation theology is sometimes considered a contextual theology of Latin America. So having spent a lot of time talking about Gustavo Gutierrez and liberation theology in general, that then has addressed some of the driving issues that comes out of that context, and we can add to this the forms of Pentecostalism that reflect that. But of course, there's also broader questions. We can talk about the native peoples of the Americas as having their own distinct kind of theology that derives from their experiences, both from their histories and peoples, but also in the way that colonial impact shaped and often destroyed their culture. So in leaving this part out, I'm not negating that, but I'm just, in the interest of time, just putting some markers here. As I said, liberation theology is a larger contextual category that extends with other contexts too. So it's not just Latin America, even though it's initiated and seen as that, but it's other contexts that are interested in civil rights issues have taken on a liberation theology. So we can talk about liberation theologies from within context. It becomes its own theological framework that then can apply to a lot of different themes, and each of these themes is speaking out into it a very important voice. So we can talk about Black liberation theology, we can talk about Minjung theology, which is a Korean liberation theology, and so on. Space and time restraints prevent more thorough focus on the expressions, but again, it's not to dismiss or diminish these. It's just these are equally important contextual contributions, but I'm trying to give a wider view so that you have a taste of a lot of different themes that may then, some of which may then intersect with your own context. And you may say, well, this is something I want to study. My goal is to get you to study more. Note that, as I said, increasingly African and Asian theologies in their various forms will become the dominant expressions of Christianity in this world, and will drive theology towards these as themselves being the supposed standard. And so the lessons that we're learning from this post-Christian time of Europe will then need to be hopefully remembered by Asian theologians and African theologians and Latin American theologians in the future, or they will have to be relearned. And that's my hope coming out of this post-Christian context, is to speak what are the mistakes that were made in the kind of patterns. Let us go forward into these broader global voices, but not make the same kind of mistakes. But it's easy to do because it's easy in throwing off the old. You not only throw off the shackles that it had, but you also throw off the good contributions, and you throw off the lessons that are learned. So welcome to the context, Europe and North America. You're part of the global community now, theologically and in every way. So let's look at African theology. Key question: how does Christianity take shape in light of African history, experiences, and values? This is a driving question for a lot of African theologians who are coming out into their own voice in a post-colonial understanding in which they're trying to wrestle with both the European colonialism and also re-piecing together the pre-European context and also the post-colonial context, in which there continues to be forms of oppression and questions and driving issues that the European theologies didn't address, and now they're realizing that left these theologies somewhat anemic or liable to some difficult mistakes like the health wealth gospel. Note that there's a question here of syncretism, and this is often the critique you hear from more traditional European theologians or North American theologians. It's this idea that, these African theologians are bringing in their religions. That is something that is always true. There's always been syncretism, and this is why the question here may be different than immediately assumed. The question is, which elements of established Christian theology adopted particularly European modes of thought and cultures or values? So it's not that I'm saying the issue of syncretism is let's find out where in African theology they're blending their culture. It's actually African theologians are doing excellent work in pointing out where European theologies brought in their own syncretism. How much of what was colonial missionaries brought was particularly Christian, and how much was merely European culture. Now, some want to throw the baby out with the bathwater of this, just toss the whole thing out, and that's not helpful, because there's a truth of what the missionaries brought, but not all of it is the same level of truth. Some of it can be tossed out as being European contextual. Some of it needs to be held on, and some of it is this blend where you have to unknot and piece together and identify. For instance, dress. How does someone dress? What do buildings look like? What is singing? Enlightenment rationalism. This is really a lot more of the present conversation. How much of Enlightenment rationalism, the way that it has been so focused on a kind of narrow understanding of knowledge and knowing and participation in this world, how much of that is European versus what is Christianity offering a form of knowledge that is actually distinct from the Enlightenment rationalism, even though Christian theology has become so over-identified with this kind of rationalism that everyone assumes that's just what it is. Africa is one of the, if not the fastest growing regions of Christianity in the world. Although the roots of African Christianity go back to the New Testament, and Northern Africans were the most important theologians for the first 4th century, the main roots of the current growth are connected to the missionary movement of the 19th and 20th century. Now, when I jump from the 4th century all the way to the 19th, 20th century, I'm not saying that Christianity was completely missing. There were certainly thriving Christian communities, especially in Ethiopia, but also throughout. And some recent work by Vince Mantu and others are pointing out there are these Christian communities that really were thriving amongst other majority kinds of expressions. Africa now can be said to be the heartland of global Christianity. What does it mean to be the heartland? It's where the lifeblood is flowing out of. There's the passion, the excitement, the thriving, the growth. A massive geographic and cultural shift has been taking place, even though the theological shift has been a lot slower in coming. And this note here the influence of African bishops in the disputes of the Anglican Church and more recently the Methodist Church, where you have the Africans not just being a physical presence, but because of the massive growth, their authority and role and theological and ministerial voice is starting to take a kind of power that sadly causes the establishment to feel threatened. Even though the establishment might talk a good game about diversity, they respond out of feeling threatened of their power. Diversity is great as long as it doesn't interrupt my power source, right? Well, that's a form of paternalism, and you can start spotting it in some of these conversations very quickly. Some issues of concern and distinction. Colonialism and post-colonialism. Christianity was identified with the colonial powers. How can these be delinked? And this isn't just a rational question. This is very a social question, because there's a lot of resistance against Christianity based on its colonial influence and the missionaries' impacts. So there's a lot of people who have this very visceral response of Christianity as being a representative of the West and its power source. And so how do we decouple this? Another key question African theologians are asking that hasn't been asked in certainly Enlightenment European theology, and not really even in early Christianity nearly as much, is the role of ancestors. Another emphasis is the communal emphasis rather than individual. So in Western individualism has also so completely defined the Christian narrative that evangelism, and so go down the list, it becomes isolated, that you are first an individual and then you are part of a community. Whereas in other parts of the world, in Africa is an expression of this, is first you are part of your identity is as a community, and then you are a person within that. It brings some strengths and weaknesses, but it just approaches the Christian theology from a different direction. Another key aspect, which I think is not as much new to Christianity, but as a reminder and critique of Enlightenment forms of hyper-rationalism, is the pervasive religious perspective and an awareness, engagement of the supernatural realities, that the spiritual world is bigger and broader and more involved than the Enlightenment theology has given credence to. Stronger connection with the land and environment, interaction with traditional African religions. A lot of, because of Christendom's form of being such a dominant narrative for about 1500 years, there was a significant lack of strong interreligious understanding that we see in the early church and then see in the global theology. In Africans, this is a very pressing reality. And other concerns that are derived from not just this broader African context, but are coming in from South African concerns or Northern African concerns, the intersection of Islam in Northern and Central Africa. Eastern Africa has issues, Western Africa. All these concerns in economics and the kind of human realities that come into the African theologians' question. Now again, note that these issues aren't limited to African theologians, but can find resources in both earlier missionary endeavors, like the earlier Irish had a very pervasive understanding of spirituality and connection with the land. So a lot of what African theology is doing is calling us back to sources that may have been cut out or minimized more lately in the West, but are actually consistent themes across Christian cultures from very early on and across even more establishment parts of the world. Okay, now let's turn to Asian theology. Again, an all too quick journey through a very, very broad and expansive discussion that is worth significantly more time. But that's why I also encourage you to do the readings, and in the readings to look at the footnotes, and in the footnotes to look to see other resources. So I'm not saying, again, I'm trying to cover it all. I'm pointing you in directions. I'm saying, here's a little guidebook, but there's a lot more to see. Note that in all these theologies are both helpful in narrowing the discussion while also being rather arrogant in claims to speak for whole regions or contexts. And I mentioned this before, and it's probably even more profound when it comes to talking and saying there's this Asian theology. Well, what is Asia in terms of the specific histories and stories going on among the different people groups of that biggest of continents? Each have multiple experiences. So we should be careful in reducing many cultures to their most general continental categories. Do Japanese have the same experience as the Chinese? Do Syrians have the same experience as Indians? Do Siberians have the same experience as Indonesians? No. Not only do they have different experiences, they have different geographical contexts that just are pushed into almost absurd situations trying to package them all together, and yet from a perspective in the United States, that's Asia. But I mean, I think personally there's distinctions among the many. I think there's a Georgian theology, not Georgia in the former Soviet Union, but Georgia in the southern United States is different than an Oregon theology, is different than a northeastern theology. I think different regions of the United States have different theologies that we've collapsed into very decontextualized approaches where academics just go here and there and don't actually represent their actual context, and so we lose sight of the fact that the living experiences in these different places have very different identity. But I'm not talking about the United States, I'm talking about Asia. Asian theology, generally Asian theology refers more to East Asia and occasionally the subcontinent. And so when you talk about Asian American, the tendency in our use of that term is to talk about East Asian and hardly ever West Asian, let alone North Asian. Even within this category, there's vastly different languages and cultures and experiences. I mean, it's such an obvious point, and yet theology likes to collapse it because Asian theology is a much more approachable category than to actually get into the complexity and the theologies that derive that from these. But as Christianity continues to take root and expand and grow within these contexts, we have to become more and more attentive to the differences. I mean, a great way of addressing this, what was the Asian experiences of World War II, for instance? That just drives it home, because the Asian experiences of World War II is not some simple common thread. There were actively forms of oppressed and oppressors within the Asian context, and the Asian experience of World War II was vastly different depending on what side and what group and where you were. What was the Filipino experience of World War II? What was the Chinese experience of World War II? What was the Indonesian experience of World War II? What was the Indian experience of World War II? All these things become different ways of understanding the complexity when we say that this moment, this 5-year span, if it's a little longer actually because of the Japanese invasion of China. How is that? How do you package that? And if you have this much complexity and distinction within such a narrow time range, what about expand that to the extent of that history? Whew! It's certainly as diverse as European experiences, which means that we have to be attentive to the diversity within categories, again, not just the broad generalizations. Africa is the same, as are the rest of the continent. Now, maybe Antarctica, we can generalize and say that there's one Antarctican voice, McMurdo Station or something like that. Those pesky meta-narratives sneak back in just when we think we're doing good. Some key issues from Asian theological concerns in its broader sense, maybe even though you have different histories that bring together, these are some themes that have arisen in a broad sense. Again, we come back to the communal versus individualistic aspect, where European and American tend to have very individualistic. This is where the future of Christianity is actually going to wrestle with how do we be an individual versus communal, because these societies are really more communal oriented, and so that's going to take the trend of Christianity. Traditional role of ancestors and parents, shame as a defining category rather than guilt, which then becomes a radically key issue in discussing salvation topics, which have been shaped almost exclusively by the narrative of guilt and individualism in the West. Colonialism and Western imperialism as linked with Christianity, expressions of Christianity that can reflect concerns in Hinduism, Buddhism, Shintoism, Islam. This is why I love using Karkanen's work, because he actually engages these continuing developing questions of theology that much of the West just doesn't know what to do with. He's unique in really seeing the integrated role of addressing these different religions. The role and place of suffering, the concern for humanity and freedom, key issue in traditional Korean theology and Indian subcultures like the Dalits. And so you have this, what does it mean to be free? What does it mean to be free in a Christian sense when society has much more constrained caste system or social systems? And this is where you can see this in more traditional, even European theologies. We're trying to break out of the medieval structures, but it's not as much in keeping with contemporary discussions where, for instance, the United States, everyone's like, everyone's free, right? It's not true, but there's this assumption of that being there. Since the 1970s, there's been a trend away from indigenization, which is translating Western Christianity into Asian contexts, and toward contextualization, starting from the core roots of Christianity and then assessing those uniquely through Asian contributions and questions. So rather than taking the Western stuff and just translating and say, well, how does this fit? We say, what is God doing among our nation, our context in Asia? The latter points towards the increasing importance of regional churches in Asia, especially in Korea and China. Korea is the #1 missionary sending country per capita, which means Korean theology and Korean Christianity is having a broader global impact than any other specific source, and that has and will continue to have important implications. Chinese church is among the numerically largest, even in terms it exists in two forms: the state approved and the underground church. We also could have added to that the Hong Kong church, which is now a third important piece and discussion, which has blending into these, but is also both a protest church of sorts. And so we have how do we navigate these different kinds of churches that exist in a non-majority setting? And this is where Christianity that hasn't had that kind of experience and discussion prior to the last 1,500 years, where you have both a growing, thriving community in context where they're not the majority. Well, how do they navigate politics? How do they navigate social resistance? How do they navigate social change? How do they navigate being true to their Christian calling, but while not betraying their own participation in culture? These are very important questions, and that's why I think this is exciting time of theology, because we're really, rather than going over the same questions we've been doing for 1,000 years. I mean, Aquinas really set the stage, and we've been wrestling with Aquinas in the West really since then. What do we have now is these completely different resources we're drawing from and speaking back into. And from that, I can just encourage you to read deeply more, dig into your own context, find your own voices, be confident in that, and don't think you have to conform to the establishment version just because that's what people with power say you have to do. Know that God is speaking through your voice and your context, and the best way you can contribute to the global conversation and your own understanding and calling is to own that story and engage in the Spirit, and then in that way you can listen, learn, and speak in a way that is just empowering for us all.